Good day, everyone. I am the Synodic Scribe. You know, for as long as I've played Final Fantasy XIV, I've rarely, if ever, voiced my opinion and true feelings on the game itself over the years. Mostly because, instead of complaining needlessly over every little change or detail, I prefer to let the developers feel things out. I don't want a game made just for me. I want the creators to impress me with their own vision. But for the first time in a while, I'm not impressed with 14. And for the first time on this channel, I want to talk about that. But instead of simply complaining about what I don't currently like, I want to discuss my experience with the game and how I got to this point. But, by all means, after this video is over, be sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. And, as always, fellow content creators have my full permission to react to my content on their platforms as well. Not just because I want to hear other people's opinions, but because I want to see if I'm simply the only one that feels this way. Perhaps Final Fantasy XIV just isn't made for me anymore, and I need to hear my peers tell me that. But, before I begin, allow me to say this for the developers of Final Fantasy XIV. Anata no doryuko to saino ni kokoro kara kansha shimasu. I really hope I didn't screw that up. When I was a kid, I was first exposed to an MMO called Final Fantasy XI, and I was blown away. Suffice to say, I'd already started playing games at that point in my life, and the idea of experiencing a game with friends and fellow adventurers in a living, breathing world felt magical to me, and it still does. I personally feel that MMOs alone have the ability to inspire unique player experiences, and that's what makes them special. They have the potential to tackle content that your typical single or even multiplayer games just don't have the ability to. So imagine how excited I was later in life to hear that Final Fantasy was going to get a brand new MMO in the form of Final Fantasy XIV. I had reached a point in my life where I was finally starting to make a little bit of money for myself, so I swore that I was going to be boots on the ground day one with this brand new MMO. That made the disappointment of what was about to happen that much more painful. I had invested early into 1.0, gaining access to the early beta and everything. And understandably, I was in shock at how unfinished the game felt. Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 was indeed as bad as people say it was. Combat was clunky, many environments felt colorless or drab, and basic functions like map navigation was an absolute nightmare. I'm not kidding when I say the forests around Gridania was a literal grid map. So I won't waste much time on what 1.0 did wrong because that could be an entire video in itself, but suffice to say, I felt cheated. The first new MMO that I devoted what little money I had to play easily felt like the worst investment I had ever made. And because I didn't have a lot of money, I didn't stick around long. The game wasted about a month or a month and a half of my time before I unsubbed and walked away, taking this as a life lesson and damaging my opinion of Square Enix quite thoroughly. When I heard that 1.0 was getting nuked into oblivion, I sorta smiled as I watched people react to its eventual downfall. I didn't feel anything for Eorzea's ruin because it never inspired any kind of love from me. Sure, there were aspects of the lore and jobs that I found interesting, but minor interest couldn't overcome the horrible UI, messy quest design, and lifeless world. And so, 1.0 ended, and life moved on. Years after the initial launch, 2.0 would be announced, and at first, I couldn't care less. After experiencing the mess of 1.0 firsthand, I figured there was no possible way that they could fix that dumpster fire of a game. But to my surprise, I was hearing nothing but good things, and eventually one of my friends at the time passionately encouraged me to give it another chance. I was beyond skeptical, but I wasn't able to scratch that MMO itch for years at that point, and I was desperate for a decent experience. So, I used my old 1.0 logins and resubbed my account. And then... To say that I was impressed would be an understatement. The developers for A Realm Reborn had done the impossible, completely redesigning a failed product into a vibrant and engaging world. But mind you, they built up 2.0 in just a couple years, when some game studios end up taking an entire decade just to release an MMO's beta phase. The success story of 2.0 was completely unheard of in the games industry, and I don't want to imagine the amount of sleepless nights they must have had to pull off this miracle. But I will die on the hill that A Realm Reborn deserves every credit it has earned for the studio's work ethic and passion alone. As for myself, I began running around with fate parties to grind experience, reading over various textbooks to learn what lore had changed after the calamity, and once I was level 50, I tackled what was currently endgame at the time: Titan Hard Mode. I was so back, and one of the friends I made along that journey is still one of my best buddies to this very day. The first jobs I made were Dragoon and Summoner, and I was once again super excited for the future of this MMO. Over the years, Final Fantasy XIV would evolve and change in every expansion. Heaven's Word solidified 14's amazing story-driven content. Stormblood improved boss encounters, and Shadowbringers felt like it was carrying on that torch into the future. I was very happy to be a 14 fan. Now, did I like everything they were doing? Of course not. There were changes and augments to things like jobs and some encounters that I didn't care for. For example, when Steps of Faith originally released as a trial, I thought it was a fun change of pace from the usual tank and spank. Nothing fancy, but nothing too difficult. Chain the dragon down with magic and then use giant weapons to deal huge chunks of damage. Easy. So imagine my shock when I heard people complaining that it was too hard. The fact that they nerfed that fight shortly after for those who couldn't follow even the most simple mechanics, to me, was a very bad sign. But I had faith that these were only bumps in the road, growing pains that came with the game slowly rocketing up to become one of the most popular MMOs in the entire world. Of course, a few changes were going to be necessary to cater to a bigger crowd, and the developers had my full support. After all, if they were able to turn a pit stain like 1.0 into the gem that was A Realm Reborn, I was confident that they could change course at any point if certain decisions weren't working out. To that end, I present another example from Heaven's Word, the Diadem, released in 3.1. The Diadem was not super well received, but I could see what they were trying to do when it came to this community-powered content. And that alone earned my respect, because at least the developers were visibly exploring other forms of entertainment right after launching their first expansion. You know, instead of resting on their laurels and not even trying. I like to think what they learned from Diadem helped to lay the groundwork for content like Eureka in Stormblood, which I personally loved. And additions such as the Baldessian Arsenal felt like they were taking full advantage of the kind of content MMOs alone are able to generate. Holding up to 56 players, the Arsenal was the first huge raid of its kind in Final Fantasy XIV, and I had an amazing time. While many players didn't care for the story of Stormblood, the expansion itself did wonders for encounters and boss design, and the trials in Stormblood felt more like cinematic experiences. And if you're curious as to what job I was playing at that time, I'm a spellsword lover, so I had chosen to main Dark Knight the moment Heavensward Early Access became available, and I was absolutely loving the fact that Dark Knight was considered the magic tank. At the time. But don't worry, we'll come back to that later. Suffice to say, player-driven content like Eureka, Bozia, Ishgard Restoration, and more, combined with the engaging MSQ and plenty of side content to play with groups and solo players alike, made me feel like the future of 14 was very bright. I mean, this game went from having absolutely no PvP to having frontlines, which, while very unbalanced at the start, was still a lot of fun. And they've done nothing but try to improve upon the PvP experience ever since. Now we have Crystalline Conflict, and most people love it, me included. So why wouldn't I have faith in the developer's vision for the future? But in the background, something was starting to nag at me, and I wasn't able to really put my finger on it until the post-content of Shadowbringers. You see, by the time Shadowbringers had launched, Final Fantasy XIV had started what I believe to be an odd process of changing or cutting back on content in big ways. We had lost job quests in favor of role quests. Field operations like Bozia, while fun, had ended abruptly, with the remaining story being told in info cards instead of cutscenes. Not only were we getting less dungeons with every expansion, but even lower level dungeons were suddenly being transformed to match the linear model of modern dungeon design. And the jobs themselves weren't untouched, as what many players call job homogenization had already begun, robbing some jobs of skills and abilities that had helped to set them apart from each other. It felt as if everything was becoming excessively formulaic, predictable, safe. Like the developers were going through the motions instead of trying new things. To me, it felt like that candle of creativity was starting to be snuffed out, and I had no idea why. Even the 24-man raid in Shadowbringers felt more like one massive advertisement for a completely different video game instead of something that had any business being a raid in this MMO. Don't get me wrong, the near raids were a lot of fun, but that's because Final Fantasy XIV is fun. At most, the near raids simply confused the lore while encouraging players to spend money on other Square Enix-owned properties. And to be clear, I'm not against crossover events from other franchises, but don't ever make a crossover take up what is considered to be mainline content. So, post-Shadowbringers was the first time in my many years of loving 14 that I had begun to feel skeptical again. Now, I understand, not all of these changes were without merit, and some changes were indeed for the best. To further complicate things, the times back then were far from ideal for the development staff. COVID had come out in full swing, and their studio had been tasked with creating Final Fantasy XVI on top of fueling 14's continued support. Not an easy task, to be sure. But some stuff wasn't making sense to me. The numbers weren't adding up. When asked about things like job homogenization, the official response was that it was due to player feedback. But whenever I looked around to do my own research, the only posts I could find that genuinely wanted these changes were forum posts with a few hundred or 1,000 upvotes. That might sound like a lot, but Square Enix has constantly been promoting how 14 has crazy player numbers. Their own ads would state that the game has over 16 million adventurers, so making radical changes to jobs just for a few thousand players didn't make any sense to me at all. And then, the content to play in the game had begun to dry up. How was Final Fantasy XIV, supposedly one of the most profitable MMOs at the time, lacking the staff and funds to create new content? Like I said, the numbers didn't make sense to me. And then, all of my concerns came to a head with the release of Endwalker. If you enjoyed Endwalker, then I am very happy for you. But in my own opinion, it's currently the weakest expansion 14 has to offer for a variety of reasons. Whereas Stormblood and Shadowbringers tried to do new things with community content, Endwalker gave us almost nothing. If anything, Endwalker as an expansion felt more focused on the single-player experience than anything else, with the addition of Island Sanctuary and the removal of relic weapons. Because I refuse to call the tombstone weapons in Endwalker true relics. Their acquisition was embarrassingly easy. For the first time while playing Final Fantasy XIV after the release of A Realm Reborn, I felt like I had nothing to do, and I was only logging in to do my usual dailies and weeklies. Even grinding for mounts, like I usually did with my free company, lost all its appeal when I realized we were getting some bland Bahamut holding a chair. For those who don't know, collecting the trial mounts in Final Fantasy XIV usually followed a theme. In A Realm Reborn, you collected elemental horses to eventually get the Radiant Kidding. Heavensward had birds, which led to you gaining a golden phoenix. Stormblood gave you a nine-tailed fox for collecting canines, and Shadowbringers gave you a mega dragon for collecting dragons. Endwalker was the first expansion to break this cycle and reward the player with something that felt uninspired. Here I was expecting to get some kind of amazing star cat for collecting all the lynxes, and we got this. The only content in Endwalker I looked forward to was the Myths of the Realm raid, which was a lot of fun, but even those couldn't stop me from feeling like this expansion wasn't worth the subscription. Yet I remained subscribed because I believed in the developers. To that end, I was hoping that finally attending the Final Fantasy XIV Fan Festival in 2023 would get rid of some of these feelings. And while I had tons of fun at the convention, it was mostly because of the people I met and got to know, not because of 14 itself. So imagine my surprise when all the other content creators I met were telling me that 2023's North America Fan Festival was a complete joke compared to the other conventions and previous fan fests. Between the convention and how I felt about 14 at the moment, it felt like development and improvement from the studio had become an afterthought. So when the Job Actions trailer came around for Dawn Trail, I felt nothing. In fact, I felt worse than nothing. I was angry, because even then I could tell we were losing even more abilities in what I felt was an already boring job system. And honestly, the straw that finally broke the camel's back, the thing that made me finally want to make a video like this, was the announcement of that dumb mobile game. The content in this MMO is starting to feel like an afterthought, and suddenly they're advertising a mobile game. You've got to be kidding me. I understand that the mobile game was likely not made by CBU3, and that the game itself is more for the booming mobile market of China and Japan, but that still didn't stop me from feeling incredibly annoyed. So now we arrive at my current thoughts and feelings on Final Fantasy XIV. Do I think the game is worth playing? Of course I do. If this is your first time watching one of my videos and you're still on the fence about trying this game, I encourage you to play it for yourself. The free trial is shockingly generous. In fact, I wouldn't have made hundreds of lore videos for this MMO if I didn't love it. So where does my love for the game meet my disappointment? Currently, I feel the developers of Final Fantasy XIV have lost sight of what makes an MMO unique. The hyper-focus on single-player content, oversimplified gameplay, and lack of community-driven events, in my own opinion, has caused the game's engine to stall. I'm not the first content creator to ask Square Enix who they're making all these radical changes to the game for, and now I'm adding my voice to the confusion. If players really have been asking for these changes, then I'd like to see receipts. How many players have been asking, and where are those players coming from? I want to see the data. Because ultimately I don't know what's to blame here, and I feel like I'm grasping at straws. If I had to guess, either the developers are listening to a very small niche section of the community that they need to stop listening to exclusively, or these are corporate decisions and they're simply saying that the player base asked for them. So perhaps it's time to take a step back and reevaluate the current direction of the game. This isn't a knock against the developers. Every MMO has seen its low points, and the fact that it took 10 years of playing for me to want to speak up should assert that I've mostly been happy with it up until this point. Now that I've addressed my current feelings, allow me to address the two things I personally want to see in the future of Final Fantasy XIV. Firstly, I want to see a return of content that takes advantage of the fact that this is an MMO. I remember back during the days of A Realm Reborn when players would notice the shroud changing colors and everybody would get super excited to hunt for Odin together. But open world activities like that don't feel as special anymore. If you've ever been in a hunt train before, you've kinda been in all of them, as hunts themselves haven't really innovated ever since Heavensward. All activities with our grand companies seem to have stopped entirely, and the developers have never really experimented with anything like free company-based content. Imagine for a moment, my friends, something like a treasure map that's not just for a small party, but for your entire free company to experience together. Maybe you send different parts of your FC to handle different tasks before all coming back together for one final challenge. And that's your guild activity for the evening. I don't know, I'm just trying to come up with some ideas here. However, I feel that solid group or community content has been missing for years now. Heavensward, Stormblood, and Shadowbringers all proved that the development staff has the talent to experiment and push for interesting content that engages their community on a broader stage. I understand not all players enjoyed stuff such as Eureka and Bozia like I did. But at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, it's content. It's something to do, a grind or adventure for you to enjoy at your own leisure. Can these forms of content be improved upon? Of course. I'd love to hear what people would have added to something like Eureka to make it more fun. But to say that Eureka failed completely is also incorrect, as it not only brought many players together, it also inspired some groups to continue working together on that content for years after the fact. Only an MMO is able to do things like that. We're currently starving for things to do because some people couldn't stop whining about the food. Instead of sending it back to the kitchen every time, why not ask what kind of spices or sauces they might add to make it more palatable? At the end of the day, gaming as a hobby is a time sink, and MMOs are notorious for demanding more of a player's time than most other types of games. So perhaps don't immediately start groaning when you can't complete something in the first day. Reach out to other players, enjoy the content together. MMOs are a massive multiplayer experience, and they should be enjoyed with friends and fellow adventurers. My second proposal is that I'd like to see a return to player choice when it comes to jobs and general gameplay within Final Fantasy XIV. I personally feel that job homogenization, as players call it, was a fundamental mistake. I don't know who started making those demands, but the developers need to stop listening to whoever they are. Another content creator told me something a while back that I believe was quite profound. He told me that jobs were more complex at level 60 than they are at level 100. And he's not wrong. It feels as if things like the 2-minute meta has strangled any kind of creativity or choice out of 14 when it comes to jobs and gameplay. We currently have 21 jobs as of Dawntrail, But what's the point of having 21 jobs if the things that makes them different aren't respected? Take Dark Knight, for example, my favorite job. I have never hid the fact that I hate the removal of plunge. Because it's not just the removal of plunge that annoys me, it's simply the most recent removal. I lost Dark Arts, which once changed how my skills behaved. Now there's nothing dynamic about my skills. I lost the ability to place Salted Earth wherever I want because someone, somewhere, isn't good with controls. I lost abilities when Abyssal Drain and Carven Spit were given the same cooldown, despite the fact that they had completely different effects at the time. And then, Dark Knight lost the magical tank status when Paladins kept complaining that they couldn't block magic with their shields. Which they do now. I'll stop there, but suffice to say, Dark Knight now isn't the job I originally loved, and I didn't ask for any of this. To that end, I offer my second proposal. Why not give the player some kind of choice in the matter instead of simply forcing everyone to play the exact same way? If someone can't place Salted Earth to save their life, then sure, give them the option to cast on character, but let me still have the choice to be able to place my Salted Earth wherever I want. If someone isn't good enough at the game to weave skills like plunge into their rotation, then give them the option to move abilities around and play a different way, but don't take away my skills just because someone else spends way too much time staring at FF logs. And don't worry, I know that Dark Knight isn't the only victim here. A lot of healer mains are bored out of their minds hitting the same dot and damage button over and over and over again. Heck, one of my buddies is a summoner main and he's still pissed that Carbuncle doesn't do anything anymore. It just stands there like a lobotomized rat. And as a lore channel, I can tell you with 100% confidence that you've not seen even half of what your favorite jobs are truly capable of. So why not ask the developers for more instead of less? The biggest reason job design or job options are important to me is because this is a very combat-heavy game. If you're not raiding, you're using combat to clear dungeons, fates, field operations, and just to explore the world. Jobs need to be fun to play in all forms of content and not just built around the design of endgame or oversimplified for super casual players. There needs to be a system that meets both in the middle. And before someone starts complaining about balance or the meta, let me say, there will always be a meta. Gameplay will never be perfectly balanced. Even now, in Final Fantasy XIV's current homogenized state, you've got players complaining constantly that Pictomancer does too much damage. The jobs have been balanced to the point of being mundane, and some people are still complaining even now. I personally don't get it. So I'll say this. Let's not balance all the skills and spells purely around the 2-minute meta and things like ultimate trials. Instead of making new jobs for an expansion or two, let's allow creativity to breathe and give Final Fantasy XIV's gameplay some much needed choices. I'm not asking for confusing skill trees, but even Final Fantasy XI had sub-jobs to help spice things up. I want to see Final Fantasy XIV add something to their job system to spice things up in its own unique way. And I feel that that starts with giving players some kind of choice. Because choosing between 21 jobs doesn't matter if the thing you loved about that job is removed in the very next expansion. So long as a job can clear content, that should be all that matters. Beyond that, it's up to player skill to make things work. And if content is too hard to clear, then maybe the developers made the DPS windows too tight again. I'm looking at you, Alexander series. You know exactly what you did, Pepsi Man, and I have many stories involving the raid groups that you destroyed, buddy. Honestly, I'm glad I wasn't raid leading at that time. Oddly planned is the nicest way for me to describe a lot of the raid content in Heaven's Word. But honestly, that's all I want at the moment from the team over at Creative Business Unit 3 right now. Sure, there are other things I could go into, but if these two things alone were addressed, to me, that would be enough for now. Like I said, when it came to A Realm Reborn, they did the impossible. So I know that under the right circumstances, they have the creativity to wow me with something spectacular. As for now, I'll keep making lore content as I usually do, but with things being as they currently are, I felt like getting this off my chest. So I thank you for bearing with me. But just like I stated at the beginning, don't forget to let me know your thoughts as well. I know this isn't my usual type of content, but if you enjoyed my cadence today, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join me as I cover even more lore content in the future. But as always, I thank you all very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing what else Dawntrail has in store for us in the future. But until that day comes, stay safe, my friends. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoy my content, it would mean the world to me if I had earned you as a subscriber. We are currently on the road to 50k, and I'd love to have you as part of that journey. I'd also like to take this time to thank my amazing Patreon supporters. Nanama, Amina Viltaria, Slippers, Oskan Hawk, Naria O'Meara, Potato, Seth Rosewood, and Sinalv Bagel. Your support has always meant so much to me and helps to keep the content flowing with ease. If you're interested, there are additional links down in the description to my Discord, X, and other things as well. But until I see you again, I hope you're having an amazing day. Class dismissed.